The High Stakes Reveal. When an elite Navy SEAL noticed his dog's new collar felt slightly off balance, he didn't expect to find a micro-etched tactical map hidden inside the brass buckle. These encrypted coordinates lead to a remote mountain cache, proving this wasn't just a random purchase. It was a high-stakes handoff from a deep-cover operative. What he uncovered wasn't just a secret. It was a system hiding in plain sight, watching everything. And the deeper he went, the more he realized he wasn't chosen by chance. In a world where nothing can be trusted, the only thing left might be instinct, or something greater guiding it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subs for more powerful stories. The mornings in northern Montana carried a kind of clarity that felt almost artificial, like the world had been reset overnight. Snow still clung to the edges of the pine forest beyond Ethan Cross's cabin, catching the early light in thin, reflective layers. The sky was pale, clean, and indifferent. No movement, no urgency, just stillness. Ethan Cross stood on the wooden porch for a moment longer than necessary, a mug of black coffee cooling slightly in his hand. At 40, he carried the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. He stood just over 6 feet tall, his build lean and efficient, shaped by endurance rather than display. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a strong, square jaw and sharp cheekbones, the skin weathered lightly by years of cold wind and harsher places. His dark brown hair was cut in a military style, short but not regulation tight anymore. Enough to remind him of who he had been. Not enough to say he still belonged there. His gray-blue eyes scanned the tree line out of habit, not because he expected something, because once not expecting had cost lives. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Vargo stepped out first. The German shepherd moved with quiet control, his black and tan coat catching the same pale light. He was 4, maybe 5 years old, solid, working line build, not oversized but precise, one ear tilted slightly outward, just enough to give him a distinct, almost thoughtful expression. His eyes were dark, attentive, always measuring. He didn't bark, he didn't rush, he simply took position beside Ethan, looking in the same direction. They stayed like that for a few seconds, man and dog, both still, both listening to something that wasn't there. Or maybe was. Ethan exhaled slowly and turned back inside. The package was waiting on the table. It had arrived late the previous evening. Standard delivery, no signature required, no irregularities on the outside, just a brown box with a printed label from a vendor Ethan had used before. Tactical gear, reliable, familiar. He cut the tape with a small folding knife. Inside, wrapped in plain plastic, was the new collar. At first glance, it looked exactly as expected. Reinforced stitching, matte-finished brass buckle, adjustable strap built for working dogs. Nothing flashy, nothing unnecessary. Ethan picked it up, then paused. The difference was subtle, but it was there. Weight, not enough for anyone else to notice. Not enough to trigger suspicion in a casual inspection. But Ethan didn't do casual. He turned the collar slowly in his hands, letting the muscle memory of years of equipment checks guide him. Balance, density, response. Something was off. Behind him, Vargo had gone completely still. Not curious, not relaxed. Still. Ethan didn't look back immediately. He had learned that sometimes noticing too quickly changed what you saw. Instead, he walked to the workbench. The kit was already there, compact, precise, assembled out of habit rather than need. Tools he had no official reason to keep anymore. Tools that had saved him more times than he could count. He activated the handheld density scanner. A faint hum filled the quiet room. Ethan ran the scanner along the collar, slow and deliberate. The readings were normal, leather, thread, metal, then a shift, small, sharp, out of place. He went back. Slower this time, the signal repeated, localized, inside the buckle. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He set the collar down carefully and reached for a micro tool. Precision mattered now. He disassembled the buckle piece by piece, each movement controlled, patient, exact. The brass casing came apart with a faint metallic click. Inside, the spring-loaded release mechanism sat exactly where it should. Until he looked closer. There, behind the pin. Something that didn't belong. Ethan adjusted the light, angling it just enough. And saw it. A surface so small it barely existed to the naked eye, etched with a pattern so precise it couldn't be accidental. A data matrix, laser-etched, military-grade. Ethan didn't touch it immediately, he just stared, because he knew what that meant. Behind him, Vargo let out a low, quiet sound, not a growl, not a warning, something in between. Ethan turned. The dog wasn't looking at the door, wasn't looking outside. Vargo was staring directly at the collar, locked onto it, body tense, but not aggressive, recognizing, not reacting. As if the object on the table wasn't new to him, as if it had meaning. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a memory trying to surface, but not fully formed. Vargo took one step closer, then stopped, waiting. Not for a command, for a decision. Ethan turned back to the table. His mind was already moving. Fast, too fast. He forced it to slow down. Think, not react. He leaned in and examined the etching more closely. This wasn't a manufacturing defect. It wasn't a counterfeit, and it wasn't random. The placement alone told him everything. Hidden behind a mechanical component shielded from standard scans. Accessible only through deliberate disassembly. This had been designed, planned, executed. Ethan sat back slightly, letting the implications settle. The collar had come through a vendor he trusted, a vendor tied to a supply chain he had used during his service. That meant one of two things. Either the vendor had been compromised, or someone had used the vendor as a delivery system. He reached for his tablet and pulled up the order history. Everything looked clean, too clean, the timestamps aligned, the payment processed normally, shipping data matched standard routes, no flags, no anomalies, which meant the anomaly wasn't in the system, it was in the intention. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the collar. Someone had inserted this, not into the shipment, into his shipment. That narrowed things a lot. Behind him, Vargo finally moved again, circling once before lying down near the table but not taking his eyes off the object, watching it, like it might move, or like it had already done something. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen this before. Not this exact method, but this pattern. Information hidden in plain sight, delivered through something ordinary, something no one would question. Except someone like him, which raised the only question that mattered now. Why him? He looked down at the etched matrix again. There was no label, no signature, but there was structure, and structure meant meaning. Ethan reached for a macro lens attachment and positioned it over the buckle interior. The image magnified on his screen. Lines became symbols. Symbols became patterns. Not random. Never random. His pulse slowed. Focus returned. This part he understood, this part he trusted, because data didn't lie, people did. He began capturing images, frame by frame, building a digital map of the etching. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the cabin walls. Inside, the air felt tighter, more contained, like the space itself was waiting. Ethan stopped for a second, his hand hovering above the device. A thought surfaced. Quiet, clear, unavoidable. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a wrong address. It wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had done this knew where he lived, what he would order, and how he would react. That level of precision didn't come from observation. It came from familiarity or history. Ethan leaned back slowly, eyes still on the screen. Then almost unconsciously he spoke aloud. "You knew I'd check." Vargo's ears shifted, not sharply, but enough. Ethan glanced at him. The dog didn't move. But his gaze didn't change, still fixed, still certain, and in that moment, Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than the data itself. This wasn't just a message, it was a handoff, and not just to him, to both of them. He looked back at the collar, at the impossibly small matrix etched into metal, at the silence surrounding it. Then he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that didn't release tension, just acknowledged it. A mission, he said quietly, then corrected himself. No, his eyes hardened slightly. Something that didn't go through the system. Vargo remained still, but present, as always. Ethan reached out and carefully reassembled the buckle, sealing the mechanism back into place. Not to hide it, to protect it. For now. He stood, the chair sliding back with a soft scrape. The cabin felt different, same walls, same light, but no longer neutral. Something had entered the space, and it wasn't leaving. Ethan picked up the collar again. This time the weight felt different, not heavier, just understood. He looked at Vargo. The dog stood immediately. No hesitation, no command needed. Ethan gave a faint nod, more to himself than anything else. And in the quiet of that northern morning, with snow still catching light and the world pretending nothing had changed, Ethan Cross knew one thing with absolute certainty. This hadn't arrived by accident, and whatever it was, it had been meant to find him. Ethan Cross had spent enough years around classified systems to know that information revealed itself in layers. The first layer was what you noticed. The second was what you confirmed. The third was what made you wish you had stopped at the first. By late afternoon, the light outside his cabin had gone pale and thin, sliding across the snowfields beyond the pines in long, cold bands. The temperature had dropped again. Northern Montana had a way of making evening arrive before a man was ready for it. Inside, the cabin was quiet except for the low hum of Ethan's equipment and the occasional click of Vargo's nails against the wooden floor. The macro lens rig was fixed over the disassembled buckle. On the screen, the microscopic etching no longer looked like damage or grain. It had shape, intention, symmetry. Ethan sat forward, elbows braced on the workbench, studying the enlarged image with the same patience he had once used to study entry routes and satellite overlays. At 40, he still moved with the economy of a man trained to conserve energy for the moment it mattered. His lean, controlled frame stayed almost perfectly still while his gray-blue eyes did the work. The old olive-gray tactical combat shirt on his back had softened with time, its fabric faded and worn at the shoulders. He trusted worn things more than polished ones. New surfaces lied too easily. Vargo lay near the stove, his black and tan coat warm in the low light, but he was not asleep. The German shepherd kept his head up, ears adjusting to sounds too subtle for human attention. One ear angled outward in that familiar tilt that made him look thoughtful even when he was motionless. He watched Ethan, then the table, then the windows, as if assigning equal importance to all three. Ethan transferred the image files into an isolated system, old software running on hardware that had never touched a network. He worked without hurry because hurry led to assumptions, and assumptions got men killed. The etched symbols appeared in a clean sequence now. Tiny geometric clusters arranged in repeating blocks connected by spacing patterns too deliberate to be decorative. Not text, not a serial, not a standard military cipher either. He ran the first analysis suite. Nothing. He adjusted contrast, mapped depth, separated line pressure from surface interference. The program flagged recurring ratios buried in the design. That got his attention. Ratios meant the structure could be mathematical. If it was mathematical, it could be spatial. By the time darkness settled fully outside, he had rebuilt the sequence into a grid. Then he saw it, not with certainty at first, more like the shape of something surfacing under black water. Coordinates. Not global coordinates, not latitude and longitude, a localized system. Ethan opened a regional topographic archive and began cross-referencing contour relationships, elevation markers, stream breaks, old fire roads, and defunct survey references. He rotated the grid twice before the pattern aligned with a mountain sector in the far northern range. Remote, heavily folded terrain, little access, no official route worth naming. He stared at the screen. The dead drop wasn't hidden in a city or a container yard or some crowded neutral place where anonymity did the work. It was hidden in emptiness. That meant whoever created it had expected the receiver to move, plan, endure, and navigate without support. Someone had not only meant for him to find this. Someone had meant for him to follow it. Ethan leaned back slowly, the chair giving a faint creak beneath him. He hated that the realization felt personal. Information could be random. Delivery systems could be hijacked. But precision like this carried intention. He had spent too much of his life recognizing intention in the wrong hands. He got up and crossed to the sink, splashed cold water over his face, then stood there with both hands on the edge of the counter. In the dark reflection of the window, he looked older than he did in daylight. Not fragile, not tired, just marked. There were years a man could leave behind and years that stayed in his posture forever. Ethan had too many of the second kind. He returned to the workbench and pushed deeper. Beneath the coordinate structure, there were anomalies in the metadata, tiny distortions in timing and sequence that should not have existed in a simple etched transfer. He isolated them and saw another pattern, smaller and more concealed than the first, a signature hidden under function. That was when he stopped working alone. He took an encrypted satellite handset from a locked drawer and keyed in a number he had not used in almost a year. It rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice answered, calm, controlled, no greeting. What broke? Ethan let out the smallest breath, almost a humorless laugh. Good to know your people skills are still intact. They were never skills, she replied. What happened? Lena Hartwell did not waste words because life had taught her that words were often where manipulation entered. She was 36, sharp-featured and narrow-framed, with brown hair usually tied low at the back of her neck and eyes that missed very little. Years in signals intelligence had given her a mind that saw structures before stories and betrayals before explanations. Ethan had trusted her once in rooms where trust was expensive. He had not forgotten that. I've got a physical carrier, Ethan said. Microscopic etching. Non-standard geometry, hidden second layer. Silence on the line for a beat, then, send me stills. Low band burst only, no live transfer. He did. It took her less than 11 minutes to call back. When she did, her voice had changed, not louder, just narrower. Where did you get this? In a collar buckle. That's not what I asked. Ethan looked at the screen again. Delivered through a legitimate order. Another pause. When Lena spoke again, her tone had gone colder. Then whoever built this wasn't improvising. This wasn't convenience. It was a bypass. Ethan said nothing. Lena continued. The outer structure is exactly what you thought. A local topographic dead drop grid. But the hidden layer is the part you should care about. I'm listening. It carries formatting characteristics from a compartmented Intel architecture that should no longer exist. Ethan's jaw tightened. Should? It was either buried, she said, or reabsorbed under a different name. He turned toward the window, though there was nothing to see except darkness and his own dim outline. Can you identify the origin? He asked. No, but I can identify the kind of people who would have touched it. She hesitated, not from doubt, but from precision. This came from someone with access above operational field level, not just a courier, not just an analyst, someone who understood both the system and how to hide from it. At that moment, Vargo rose from the floor without a sound. Ethan turned. The dog walked past the stove, past the table, and stopped in front of an old storage trunk against the far wall, a trunk Ethan had not opened in years. Vargo stood there motionless, staring at it with a fixed intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Ethan?" Lena's voice came through the handset, distant now. He barely heard her, because he knew what was in that trunk. Old mission folders, retired kit, things he kept sealed away, not because they were useful, but because some memories only stayed manageable when boxed and closed. Vargo looked back at him once, then at the trunk again. Not restless, not confused, certain. A chill moved through Ethan that had nothing to do with Montana cold. For a moment it felt less like the dog had noticed something, and more like he was pointing him toward it. Ethan set the handset down and crossed the room. He opened the trunk. Under an old field jacket and 2 weatherproof pouches lay a faded transfer document from a K-9 reassignment years ago. He had almost forgotten keeping it. Almost. He unfolded it. The paper was worn soft along the creases. Vargo had come to him through an irregular chain during a restructuring cycle after a joint operation overseas. The file had always been incomplete. Too many redactions, too much missing administrative context, not enough names. At the time, Ethan had accepted it because the dog had needed placement, and Ethan had needed something in his life that still knew how to move forward without talking. Now, with the paper in his hand, that old incompleteness felt less like bureaucracy and more like design. "Ethan," Lena said again, more firmly this time, "there's a signature marker buried in the 2nd layer." He picked the handset up. What kind of marker? A name. He did not ask how sure she was. Lena didn't speak in probabilities unless forced to. "Say it," she inhaled once. "Adrian Vale." The room did not change. And yet everything in it did. Ethan stared at the transfer paper in his other hand. A memory flickered at the edge of recall. A man in partial shadow, taller than average, lean, disciplined, with eyes that gave nothing away and a habit of entering a room like he was already listening to the exit. Not a ghost, then. Just a man working in places that denied paper trails. Adrian Vale had belonged to operations no one discussed directly, the kind that existed only while they were useful. He had disappeared years ago, not retired, not confirmed dead, just gone. Lena spoke more quietly now. "You know him. I knew of him. That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting." He looked down at Vargo. At the mention of the name, the dog's posture had changed. Not agitation, not fear, alertness sharpened by recognition. His dark eyes were fixed on Ethan now, waiting. Waiting for what? Ethan didn't know. "That isn't random," Lena said. "A civilian delivery channel, a dead drop grid, a buried signature from a vanished asset. If Vale embedded his name, he wanted the right person to notice it." Ethan folded the document slowly and set it on the table beside the collar. Outside, wind pressed against the cabin wall in a low sweep, then passed. The cabin was warm, but the air inside Ethan felt colder. Because a possibility had taken shape, and once shape existed, denial got harder. The collar had not simply carried information, it had carried selection. It had reached through an ordinary transaction, crossed a civilian supply line, passed untouched through systems built to notice anomalies, and arrived on his table because someone had counted on 3 things: his habits, his skill set, and his refusal to ignore what others would dismiss. Lena broke the silence. "If this is what I think it is, secure channels are compromised." Ethan stared at the dead drop map on the screen. The northern mountains waited there in silent contour lines. Not an invitation. A test. He looked at Vargo again. The dog stood close now, steady and watchful, one ear tilted outward, breathing slow and even. Past and present had just touched each other in the middle of Ethan's cabin, and neither had asked permission. He rested one hand on the workbench and let the weight of the moment settle without trying to outrun it. Then he said quietly, He knew the only way through was outside the system. Then don't go through it, Lena replied. Ethan's eyes remained on the map. He wasn't answering her. Not yet. But something had already moved inside him. Something old, disciplined, and unwelcome. Not duty, something more dangerous than that, recognition. The kind that came when a buried part of your life looked up and realized it had just been called by name. Ethan Cross didn't make the decision all at once. It came together the way most real decisions did, not as a moment, but as a narrowing of options until only one path remained. By dawn, the cabin no longer felt like a place to stay. It felt like a place that had already been seen. Ethan moved through his preparation with quiet efficiency. No wasted motion, no hesitation. At 40, his body no longer chased speed, it relied on precision. The worn olive-gray tactical shirt sat naturally against his frame, its fabric soft from years of use, its faded seams a record of time rather than neglect. He packed light. Cold weather layers, field rations, a compact med kit, rope, a thermal blanket, and a stripped-down navigation set that did not rely on satellites. No electronics he couldn't afford to lose, no signals he didn't control. On the table, the collar lay where he had left it. Ethan picked it up, studied it for one more second, then fastened it back around Vargo's neck. The German shepherd stood still as he did it, calm, accepting, as if this had already happened somewhere else before it happened here. "You lead," Ethan said quietly. Vargo didn't react, but he stepped toward the door. That was enough. The road ended long before the mountains began. Ethan left the truck behind a ridgeline, hidden from any casual line of sight, and continued on foot. The air sharpened as they climbed, thinning into something that cut deeper with every breath. Snow layered the ground in uneven sheets, hiding loose rock, shallow drops, and the kind of terrain that punished mistakes without warning. By mid-morning, the world had changed. The forest thinned, the wind strengthened, and the silence deepened into something heavier. Ethan checked his handheld GPS once, more out of confirmation than reliance. The screen flickered, then froze, then reset itself. He didn't bother trying again. The data from the collar had been clear. This place didn't cooperate with systems. It erased them. He slipped the device back into his pack. From here on, it was terrain instinct. And Vargo. The dog moved ahead, not rushing, not wandering, but following a path that only made sense when Ethan looked back at it later. Each step chosen, each direction adjusted by something that didn't show on any map. Ethan followed without calling commands. Trust for him had always been conditional. But this was something else. By early afternoon, the temperature dropped hard. Cloud cover rolled in from the west, turning the light flat and depthless. The horizon blurred into the ground, making distance harder to judge. Ethan adjusted his pace, conserving energy, watching his footing. Vargo slowed, not from fatigue, from attention. The dog angled slightly to the left, avoiding a stretch of snow that looked no different from the rest. Ethan paused, studied it more closely, then saw it. A subtle depression. Snow layered over a hollow pocket, unstable. A misstep there wouldn't kill him, but it would slow him. And in terrain like this, slowing down was the first step toward losing control. Ethan stepped around it. He didn't thank the dog. He didn't need to. Vargo moved on. The first real sign came just before dusk, not visual, not obvious, but wrong. Ethan stopped. The wind had shifted, or rather, it hadn't. That was the problem. The air felt contained, muted, as if the terrain itself was holding sound back. He crouched, pressing his gloved hand into the snow, feeling for vibration, for any sign of subsurface movement. Nothing. Then Vargo stopped completely, not alert, not tense. Still, Ethan followed his line of sight. At first, he saw nothing, just rock, snow, and shadow. Then the shape resolved. Edges where there shouldn't be edges, lines that didn't belong to nature. A structure, partially buried, partially collapsed, but unmistakably man-made. Vargo moved forward slowly, then stopped several feet from the structure. He didn't approach, didn't sniff, didn't circle. He just stood there, watching. Ethan came up beside him, eyes scanning the area. No tracks, no recent disturbance, no visible entry point. But the dog's posture wasn't caution, it wasn't uncertainty, it was recognition. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, something closer to alignment. Like two separate timelines had just overlapped in the same place. Vargo lowered his head slightly, not submissive, focused. Waiting, not for safety, for permission. Ethan stepped forward. The structure revealed itself in fragments as he got closer. Reinforced concrete, weathered and cracked. Steel supports exposed where the outer layer had eroded. Snow had filled the lower section, sealing parts of it like a natural barrier. No markings, no identifiers. Which meant it had either never been documented or had been erased. Ethan circled once, keeping distance, reading angles, looking for signs of entry, ventilation, anything that suggested functionality. Then he saw it, a narrow break in the rock face behind the structure. Not natural, too clean, too deliberate, partially hidden by wind-driven snow. He brushed the surface aside with his glove. There it was, a recessed panel, metal, old, but intact. Ethan didn't touch it immediately. He stepped back instead, looked around again, listened. The silence here wasn't empty. It was controlled, engineered. That realization settled slowly. This wasn't just a hidden location. It was a place designed to disappear. The kind of place that only existed if someone maintained the idea that it didn't. Ethan exhaled, the breath fogging in front of him. Behind him, Vargo shifted slightly, repositioning, not closer to the structure but to Ethan's side. Protective, but not afraid. That mattered. Ethan reached out. His fingers brushed the edge of the panel. Cold, solid, real. He pressed lightly. Nothing. Then adjusted pressure. A faint mechanical resistance. Old but functional. The system wasn't dead, it was dormant, which meant someone had built it to last, which meant someone had expected it to be found. Not by accident, by design. Ethan withdrew his hand. Not yet. He looked back the way they had come. The mountains stretched out behind them, vast and empty. No movement, no pursuit. But that didn't mean they were alone. It just meant, if someone was watching, they were doing it well. Ethan turned back to the panel. The coordinates had led here, exactly here. No margin, no error. He understood now what Lena had meant. This wasn't a message. It was a pathway. And this structure, wasn't the destination. It was the threshold. Ethan rested his hand against the cold metal once more, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this point. Then he spoke quietly. Not to Vargo, not to anyone listening, just to the moment itself. All right. Behind him, Vargo remained steady, unmoving, certain. And in the fading light of the northern mountains, with the wind held strangely still and the world narrowed down to stone, snow, and silence, Ethan Cross understood one thing with complete clarity. He hadn't just followed the signal. He had arrived exactly where he was meant to stand. Ethan Cross did not rush the entry. Rushing was what people did when they believed time was their enemy. Ethan knew better. Time only became an enemy when you lost control of it. He crouched beside the recessed panel, gloved fingers resting lightly against the metal surface, feeling for imperfections, heat variation, vibration, any sign that the system beneath was still active beyond basic mechanics. Nothing obvious, which meant whatever this place was, it had been designed to wait. Longer than most people had the patience to search. Behind him, Vargo shifted position again, not stepping forward, not retreating, just adjusting his angle to keep both Ethan and the surrounding terrain in view. The German shepherd's breathing remained steady, controlled, but his attention had sharpened into something focused and deliberate. He wasn't reacting to fear, he was tracking change. Ethan pressed the panel again, firmer this time. A muted internal click responded. Not loud, not modern, mechanical. The kind of sound that came from systems built to survive neglect, not depend on maintenance. The panel gave slightly, unlocking just enough to indicate compliance. Ethan paused, listened, waited. Nothing moved around them. No shift in wind, no echo of distant disturbance, no signal of external interference. Only silence. He slid his fingers into the edge and pulled. The panel opened inward with resistance, revealing a narrow downward passage reinforced with old steel supports. The air that came out was cold, but not naturally cold. Stored cold, sealed cold, different. Ethan glanced once at Vargo. Stay close. The dog stepped forward immediately, not ahead, beside him. That mattered. The descent was short but steep, the steps carved directly into the rock and reinforced with metal plates worn smooth by time. No dust, no debris. The place had not been touched recently, but it had been built to resist decay. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber. Small, functional, purpose-built, no excess. A single reinforced container sat at the center, partially embedded into the ground beneath a layer of frozen earth that had been deliberately packed over it. The frost line here was deeper than expected, which meant whoever had placed it understood not just concealment, but preservation. Ethan approached slowly. Every instinct he had told him to assume the worst. Pressure triggers, chemical traps, signal pings. But the container showed none of the usual signs. No visible wiring, no modern seals, just a lead-lined casing with a manual locking system. Old, but not outdated. There was a difference. He brushed away the top layer of frozen dirt, exposing the full lid. His movements were methodical, controlled. He didn't rush even now, especially not now. When his fingers found the locking mechanism, he paused again, listened, felt, then opened it. Inside, the contents were packed with precision. No wasted space, no unnecessary layers. Ethan recognized the layout immediately. It was designed for retrieval under pressure. He lifted the first item carefully. A storage device, military-grade, encrypted, no external markings. Next, documents, printed, not digital. Which meant whoever built this had expected systems to fail or be compromised. Ethan flipped through the first few pages. The structure was unmistakable. Mission logs, access routes, identity shells, deep cover insertion frameworks. Not theory, not planning. Execution records. He slowed. Read more carefully, patterns emerged. Multiple operations, multiple regions, but all connected by one underlying method. Data movement through civilian goods, packages, equipment, household items, untraceable because they were too ordinary to question. Ethan felt something settle heavily in his chest. This wasn't a small system. This was infrastructure. And it had been running long enough to refine itself. The collar had not been an exception. It had been a node. Vargo's posture changed instantly, not gradual, not subtle, immediate. The dog's head snapped toward the ceiling of the chamber, body tightening, ears forward, eyes locked on something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan froze, not because he saw anything, but because Vargo never reacted without cause. Then he felt it. Not sound, not vibration, something else. A shift in the air, almost imperceptible, like pressure adjusting. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the chamber. Nothing visible had changed, but something had. The silence was no longer neutral. It was aware. Vargo took one step backward, closer to Ethan, not retreating, positioning. Ethan lowered the documents immediately. His focus shifted. The container, the device, the chamber itself. He scanned again, faster now but still controlled. and then he saw it. A thin seam along the interior wall, so fine it didn't exist until you knew where to look. A sensor line, not active in a visible sense, but triggered by interaction, by access. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Passive alarm, he murmured. No lights, no sound, no broadcast he could detect, but that didn't mean nothing had been sent. It meant whatever signal existed had already left. He didn't swear, didn't panic. That was for people who still believed they had time to waste. Ethan moved quickly now, but not chaotically. He secured the storage device, folded the documents into a waterproof sleeve, repacked nothing else, no attempt to reset, no attempt to hide. That phase was over. The moment he had opened the container. The system had shifted, from hidden to active. He closed the lid, not to conceal, to complete the action. Then he stood. Time to go. Vargo didn't hesitate. The dog turned toward the exit immediately. No confusion, no delay. They moved together, up the steps, out of the chamber, back into the cold, open air. The mountain felt different now, not physically, but perceptually. The same terrain, the same snow, but no longer empty. Ethan adjusted his direction instinctively, not following the exact path they had taken in. Predictability was a weakness now. Even if no one was physically present yet, the possibility existed, and possibility was enough. Behind him, the structure disappeared back into the landscape, its presence swallowed by rock and shadow. Like it had never been there. Ethan increased his pace slightly, not running, never running unless forced, but moving with purpose. Vargo stayed just ahead this time, not leading blindly, but checking, adjusting, recalibrating, working, not wandering. Ethan's mind processed what he had seen, the network, the scale, the method, civilian goods as data carriers, no centralized transmission, no obvious pattern, which meant no easy way to shut it down. And if it had been active this long, then whoever controlled it had either remained invisible or had been allowed to. Neither option sat well. The wind picked up again, cutting across the ridgeline as they moved lower. Ethan didn't look back. There was nothing to see, and if someone was coming, he wouldn't see them until it mattered. What mattered now was distance, time, control. He shifted the pack slightly on his shoulders, feeling the added weight. Not heavy, but significant. Not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. This was no longer a question, no longer a curiosity. This was evidence, and evidence changed everything. Vargo slowed slightly, glancing back once, not warning, just checking. Ethan gave a small nod. Keep moving. The dog turned forward again, and together they disappeared into the descending terrain, leaving behind the buried structure and the silent system that had just awakened. Ethan didn't know who would respond, didn't know how fast, didn't know from where, but he knew this: the moment he opened that container, he stopped being an observer and became part of the system. Ethan Cross did not go straight back to the cabin. That would have been the obvious move, and obvious moves were the first thing tracked. Instead, he altered his descent path twice, cutting across ridge lines and doubling back through narrow tree corridors where snow coverage masked direction. He didn't rush. Speed created patterns. Patterns created predictability. Predictability got people found. Vargo stayed slightly ahead now, not leading blindly but scanning, adjusting, pausing when needed. The German shepherd's movements had changed since the structure. Less exploratory, more deliberate, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep in instinct. By the time they reached the truck, the sky had gone dark again. Ethan didn't turn on the headlights immediately. He sat in silence for a full 30 seconds, hands resting on the wheel, listening. Nothing followed them. At least, nothing he could detect. He started the engine. The cabin looked exactly the same when they returned. That bothered him. Because things that didn't change when they should have were usually the most dangerous. Ethan entered first, clearing the space by habit. Corners, angles, sight lines, no disturbance, no scent shift, no sign of intrusion. Still, he locked the door behind him. then moved straight to the workbench. The storage device from the container sat where he placed it, small, unmarked, and completely silent. It didn't look like something that could reshape understanding. But Ethan knew better. He powered up the isolated system again. No external connection, no signal leakage, and inserted the device. It didn't respond immediately. That was expected. Systems like this didn't open for curiosity. They opened for intent. Ethan waited, then entered a sequence, not a code he knew, but a pattern derived from the etched matrix. The screen flickered once, then stabilized. Access granted. No prompt, no interface, just data, structured, layered, dense. Ethan leaned forward, the files opened in segments. Operational logs, routing paths, encoded identifiers. He didn't try to read everything, that would have been a mistake. Instead, he searched for anchors, names, origins, points of connection. He found one within minutes. A manufacturing chain, civilian, distributed, multiple vendors, all tied quietly to a holding structure buried under 3 layers of corporate separation. Ethan traced it backward. Each step revealed less transparency, more fragmentation, until finally a name surfaced, not in bold, not highlighted, hidden in the legal registry of a dissolved entity, Veil Dynamics. Ethan sat back slightly, not surprised but confirmed. He moved to the next layer, encrypted media. He isolated the file, ran a checksum, clean, too clean. He opened it. The screen remained black for a moment, then shifted, static, distortion, then a figure, a man seated in low light. The image was degraded, but the outline was unmistakable. Adrian Vale. He looked different than memory, leaner, more worn. His dark hair had grown longer than regulation, uneven at the edges. A thin layer of stubble shadowed his jaw, not neglect, but the kind that came from movement without pause. His eyes, gray-blue like Ethan's, held something deeper now, not fear, not fatigue, awareness, the kind that didn't turn off. He leaned slightly forward, looking directly into the camera, and spoke. "I couldn't trust the system." His voice was steady, controlled, but there was weight behind it. "So I trusted something older." The image shifted slightly, lowering, not intentionally, like the camera had been repositioned quickly. At the edge of the frame, a German shepherd, black and tan, still, watching, not looking at the camera, looking past it. Ethan's eyes flicked to Vargo instinctively. The dog was already standing. Vargo stepped closer to the screen, slowly, no hesitation, no confusion. He stopped inches from the display, his head tilted slightly, not curiosity, recognition. His breathing changed, subtle, measured, like he was aligning something internal with what he was seeing. Ethan felt it then, not logically, not analytically, but somewhere deeper. A connection forming between past and present that he hadn't consciously built. On the screen, the dog in the footage didn't move, but Vargo did. One step forward, then stillness again. Ethan's pulse slowed, not because the situation was safe, but because something had just made sense in a way logic couldn't explain. The video continued. Adrian leaned back slightly, the dim light cutting across his face, revealing more detail now. "I don't know who's still clean," he said. A pause. Short, measured. "But I know what still works." His eyes shifted, just for a second, toward the dog, then back. "They don't follow instructions." Another pause. "They follow truth." The screen flickered again. Signal degradation. Then, cut to black. No ending, no timestamp, no location, just silence. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He stared at the blank screen, then reached up and powered it down manually, not because it was finished, but because it had already said enough. Behind him, Vargo stepped back, returning to Ethan's side. Calm again, but not the same calm as before. This one carried understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand once over his face. His mind moved through the pieces: civilian supply chain infiltration, distributed data movement. A hidden network embedded in ordinary life. Adrian Vale operating outside all systems, and one more piece. The one that mattered most. Ethan looked down at Vargo, the reassignment file. The incomplete history. The reaction, not coincidence, not random alignment, transfer. Something had been passed, not just data, responsibility. He moved back to the system, isolating the remaining files, extracting what he could without triggering deeper layers. He didn't attempt full decryption. That would come later, if there was a later. For now, he needed clarity, and clarity came from decisions, not data. Ethan stood, walked to the window. The night outside was still, cold, unmoving. The kind of stillness that made it easy to believe nothing had changed, but everything had. Behind him, the collar rested on the table. Simple, worn, unremarkable. Except now it wasn't. Ethan picked it up again, held it for a second, then looked at Vargo. The dog met his gaze, steady, certain, no doubt. Ethan gave a small nod, not to confirm, to accept. He fastened the collar back around Vargo's neck, this time not as equipment, not as utility, but as something else entirely, a marker, a signal, a continuation. Ethan returned to the workbench. One by one he shut everything down, hard power off, no standby, no residual signal, no trace. He removed the storage device, sealed it, packed it, then destroyed the temporary files, not deleted, destroyed. When he was done, the system looked untouched, like nothing had ever been there, like he had never known. But he did, and that couldn't be undone. At the door he paused, just for a second, long enough to feel the weight of what he was leaving behind. Not the cabin, not the life, the option to walk away. He opened the door, cold air rushed in, sharp, clean, unforgiving. Ethan stepped outside, Vargo followed, no hesitation, no command. Behind them, the cabin remained still, unchanged, disconnected, and in front of them, the north stretched wide and silent, no directions, no instructions, no system to guide them. Only movement. Ethan adjusted his jacket slightly, eyes scanning the horizon. Not looking for answers, looking for direction. Then he spoke, almost under his breath. "All right." And this time, there was no correction, no hesitation, no doubt, because for the first time since the collar had arrived, Ethan Cross understood the truth completely. It hadn't been sent to him. It had chosen him. There was no announcement, no signal, no trace left behind that could be measured, intercepted, or understood. Ethan Cross did not disappear in a way the world could record. He disappeared in a way the system could not follow. The truck was gone before sunrise. No tire tracks remained long enough to matter. Overnight wind had swept the narrow road clean, folding snow back over the surface in soft, indifferent layers. The cabin stood exactly as it had before, quiet, still, and empty of anything that suggested departure. Inside, there was no sign of urgency, no drawers left open, no equipment scattered, no evidence of dismantled systems or erased data. Everything remained in place except Ethan, except Vargo, and that was the point. Miles away, beyond the range of the nearest paved road, Ethan moved through a stretch of broken forest where the trees grew uneven and the ground refused to settle into anything predictable. The terrain forced adaptation, constant, subtle, unforgiving. That suited him. Predictable terrain made predictable people. Predictable people were easy to track. Ethan moved with controlled efficiency, his pace steady, never rushed. The worn fabric of his olive gray tactical shirt shifted with each step, quiet against his body. The cold air bit at his face, sharpening his focus instead of dulling it. Beside him, Vargo adjusted naturally to the movement. The German shepherd no longer explored ahead in wide arcs. He stayed within a tighter radius now, not because of fear, because of purpose. There was a difference. Ethan noticed it, didn't question it. By midday, they reached a ridgeline that opened into a wide northern valley, untouched, unmarked, and vast enough to make a man feel small without trying. Ethan stopped there, Not to rest, to observe. His gray-blue eyes scanned the terrain slowly, reading lines of movement that didn't exist yet. Wind direction, tree density, elevation breaks, potential cover. He wasn't looking for someone, he was looking for the possibility of someone. That was enough. Behind him, Vargo stood still, facing a slightly different direction. Not toward the valley, toward something else. Ethan followed his line of sight. There was nothing obvious there, just distance and silence. But Vargo didn't move. Far from that ridge, in a place that did not appear on any public record, a man sat in front of a darkened screen. Marcus Rourke, 45. Tall, just over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, carrying the kind of weight that came from years of physical work rather than structured training. His face was defined by hard lines and a stillness that made it difficult to read emotion. A thin scar ran along his right temple, fading into his hairline. Old, clean, and the kind that had healed without apology. His dark brown hair was cut short, flecked with early gray. He didn't rush anything, didn't react quickly because he didn't need to. On the screen in front of him, a silent log updated. No alarms, no warnings, just a timestamp. A node had been accessed, briefly, then closed. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just considered. Someone had found it, and more importantly, someone had known what it was. That narrowed the field considerably. Marcus reached for a small device on the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't initiate a wide search, didn't trigger network sweeps or trace commands. That would have been inefficient. Instead, he activated a localized tracking protocol. Quiet, narrow, precise. He didn't need to find everything. He only needed to find the one person who mattered. Back on the ridge, Vargo suddenly stepped forward, one pace, then another, before stopping again. His body didn't tense, didn't prepare to attack or retreat. He simply stood there, staring into the distance with an intensity that went beyond awareness. Ethan watched him closely. There was no sound, no movement, nothing visible, and yet Vargo held that direction like it meant something, not like a threat, like a point, a connection. Ethan felt it again, that subtle shift that had followed them since the collar, since the structure, since the moment things stopped being separate and started aligning. Not coincidence, not chance. Something else, something quieter, more exact. He didn't speak, didn't command. He just nodded once and changed direction. Ethan moved along the ridge instead of descending into the valley. Not because he saw danger, because he trusted what he couldn't see. That was new, not unfamiliar, but different. There had been a time when he trusted systems more than instinct. Clear orders, defined objectives, structured outcomes. But that had changed, quietly, gradually. Until now, standing in a place where no signal reached, no system mapped, and no authority extended, he understood something Adrian Vale had tried to say without explaining it. Systems could be compromised, corrupted, observed, but instinct. Instinct didn't broadcast, didn't transmit, didn't leave a trail. It simply acted. Hours passed. Distance grew. The ridge gave way to denser forest again, the terrain closing around them, limiting visibility but increasing concealment. Ethan adjusted his movement, slower, more controlled, less exposure. He didn't check behind him often, because if someone was tracking him, they wouldn't be visible, and if they were visible, it was already too late. Night came without warning. One moment there was fading light, the next, darkness settled across the land like a second terrain. Ethan made a temporary stop beneath a cluster of dense pines, using natural cover instead of building anything that could be found later. No fire, no light, no sound beyond what already existed. He sat with his back against the tree, one knee raised, arms resting loosely. Vargo lay nearby, but not sleeping, never fully sleeping anymore. The collar sat against his neck, silent, unremarkable, except it wasn't. Ethan looked at it for a moment, then away because the meaning had already settled. He didn't need to keep looking at it to understand. Somewhere far behind them, movement had begun. Not fast, not obvious, but real. Marcus Rourke stood from his chair, slipping on his worn brown canvas jacket, the fabric heavy and broken in from years of use. His boots hit the floor with a dull, controlled weight. He didn't call anyone, didn't report, didn't notify. Because this wasn't the kind of work that benefited from attention. This was the kind that required patience, precision, and silence. He stepped into the dark. Back in the forest, Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not to sleep, to reset. When he opened them again, nothing had changed, and everything had. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't even escaping. He was moving forward, and that distinction mattered. Beside him, Vargo shifted slightly, settling into position without losing awareness. Ethan rested one hand briefly against the dog's shoulder. Solid, real, present. He let that anchor him, not to safety, to clarity. There would be no reports filed, no acknowledgement made, no record created. Whatever this was, it existed outside those things now. And so did he. Ethan stood slowly, adjusting his posture, scanning once more before moving. No hesitation, no doubt, just direction. Ahead of him, the forest stretched into darkness. Behind him, nothing followed that he could see, but that didn't matter anymore, because for the first time since this began, Ethan understood something completely. Not intellectually, not analytically, but in the way that only came from experience. This wasn't a mission. It was a shift. Somewhere in the world, systems continued to operate. Signals moved. Data transferred. Decisions were made in rooms no one would ever see. But none of that reached here. Not fully, not anymore. Because somewhere between a collar, a code, a mountain, and a choice, a line had been crossed. Quietly, permanently, and in the vast, silent north, where no system could fully reach and no signal could fully hold. A man and a dog moved forward, not tracked, not controlled, not predicted, and what followed them was no longer a question of if, but when. Sometimes the greatest battles are not the ones the world sees, but the ones fought quietly, within choices, within trust, within the moments when we must decide what we truly believe in. Ethan's journey was not just about uncovering a hidden system. It was about learning that not everything can be controlled, predicted, or secured by human hands. In a world built on surveillance, logic, and systems, the one thing that remained untouched was something deeper. Instinct, truth, and faith. There are moments in life when we feel lost, when the path ahead is unclear, when no system, no plan, and no certainty can guide us. And yet, something still leads us forward. Sometimes it's a quiet voice inside. Sometimes it's a feeling we cannot explain. And sometimes it comes through the most unexpected form, just like a dog who sees what we cannot. Maybe that is not coincidence. Maybe that is grace. God does not always speak in ways we expect. He doesn't always send answers in clear words or obvious signs. Sometimes he guides us through small details, through people we meet, through instincts we feel, and through moments that seem ordinary until they change everything. Ethan didn't receive a mission. He was chosen for one. And in our own lives, we may not realize it, but we are often being guided too. Not by systems, not by chance, but by something greater that sees further than we ever could. So when you feel uncertain, when you don't know which direction to take, remember this. Trust what is good. Listen to what feels true, and have faith that even in silence, God is still leading you. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share your thoughts. What did you feel? What did it remind you of in your own life? Share this message with someone who might need it today. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring stories that heal, guide, and remind us of what truly matters. And may God watch over you, protect your path, and give you clarity in moments of doubt.